Om Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swami Tapaharini. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our final class on Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga, but don't be sad. Let me explain. You might be wondering, well, we've only covered the introduction and the preface, so how can we be nearly done? There's a whole middle of the book. What we're going to do is skip the middle of the book, and today we'll be discussing a very interesting section of Raja Yoga, which is Swami Vivekananda's introduction to the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, toward the end of the book, right before his own translation and commentary on the Yoga Sutra. It's a few pages, 6 to 7 pages. We're going to discuss that. Then starting next month, we're going to rename the class Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And that doesn't mean that we're through with this text. We'll be regularly consulting Swami Vivekananda's commentaries on the different sutras, and we'll also revisit parts of the chapters that we skipped for now in the course of discussing Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. So that's the plan. So our next class on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra will be held on Thursday, March 21st. Please keep that in mind. Mark it in your calendars. And the main textbook is going to be, as I keep telling you guys, Edwin Bryant's The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And I know you're going to be happy to hear this. I'm giving you a homework assignment before our next class. It's plenty of time, 3 weeks to do this homework assignment. Okay? Because March 21st, remember, Thursday is the next class. What I want you to do is to read pages 31 to 67 of this book. There's a fat introduction that Bryant writes to the Yoga Sutra. Let me give you, I'll say this again probably in the next class, but who is Edwin Bryant? Why should we care, and why are we reading this book? He is a scholar of Indian philosophy and also a spiritual practitioner in a Vaishnava tradition. And so he kind of has both sides. There's a term called scholar practitioner. I'm a scholar practitioner. He is also a scholar practitioner. And I think that's valuable when you're discussing spiritual texts. If you're just spiritual and not scholarly, you end up being unrigorous and making all sorts of claims without justifying them, and I wouldn't encourage that. On the other hand, if you're just a scholar without the spiritual side, you can become dry, pedantic, and the spiritual core of, especially when you're talking about spiritual texts like Upanishads, Yoga Sutra, Bhagavad Gita, it's like you're blind to the most fundamental aspect of the text. So the combination is the ideal, I think. And I think, I'm not saying he's the ideal, but at least he strives to combine both these aspects. He's a spiritual practitioner on the one hand and a scholar on the other. That's at least my ideal also when I do this kind of work. And the other reason why I really like Bryant's text is because he's taking into account traditional commentaries like Vyasa, Vachaspati Mishra, and Hariharananda Aranya, and also modern scholarship. And I think it's like the only text out there that does that. So it's great. So do that. I'll say it one more time. Pages 31 to 67 of the introduction, which means they're in Roman numerals. I hope you guys know how to read Roman numerals. And so it's XXXI, that's 31, to, it's not written here, LXVII, 67. So I'm not giving you any excuses. You say, I couldn't do the homework because I don't know how to read Roman numerals. Yeah. Okay, 31 to 67. Now we get to today's section from Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga. It's an unusual introduction. I think we have to face that fact head on. It's not what you would expect from an introduction to the Yoga Sutra. what would you expect? Well, a kind of direct discussion of what Patanjali's philosophy is, a kind of overview of the text. You don't get any of that here. What you get instead is a very, what I would call, high-altitude discussion of certain issues that are related to Yoga Sutra, but there's no direct discussion of the Yoga Sutras at all in the entire introduction. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth reading. It's extremely interesting. And I personally feel, after having read the whole complete works of Swami Vivekananda, the 9 volumes, that this section, this introduction to the Yoga Sutras, this is right before his translation, is one of the most challenging pieces of writing in the entire complete works. Part of the reason is we have to keep in mind that he wrote this in 1896, or it was published in 1896. I think, right? Or was it 1900? I don't remember. Anyway, very late 19th century. And he's primarily addressing Western intellectuals. And Sri Ramakrishna used to say, to kill yourself, you only need a little nail file. To kill others, you need a sword and you need a shield. So this introduction is, Swamiji is wielding the sword and the shield with great force and vigor. And we have to be aware of that. And that's part of what makes this text so challenging. So it's just a long warning because you might be a little bit bewildered, or maybe it's just me that's bewildered and you're going to explain everything to me. It's so simple, Maharaj. You're making things complicated.
What volume is that again?
This is volume 1 of the complete works, yeah. It's just called Raja Yoga.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. What I did to prepare for this, I reconstructed what I take to be the structure of this text. And so maybe at the end of the class, I'll actually run through it quickly so that because it's really a little convoluted. Okay, let me just read the first bit of it. Okay, this is the first page about it. Introduction. This is his introduction to the Yoga Sutra. Before going into the yoga aphorisms, I shall try to discuss one great question upon which rests the whole theory of religion for the yogis. It seems the consensus of opinion of the great minds of the world, and it has been nearly demonstrated by researches into physical nature, that we are the outcome and manifestation of an absolute condition, back of our present relative condition, and are going forward to return to that absolute. This being granted, the question is, which is better, the absolute or this state? There are not wanting people who think that this manifested state is the highest state of man. Thinkers of great caliber are of the opinion that we are manifestations of undifferentiated being, and the differentiated state is higher than the absolute. They imagine that in the absolute there cannot be any quality, that it must be insensate, dull, and lifeless, that only this life can be enjoyed, and therefore we must cling to it. Let's pause. There's so much here. It's really difficult. I mean, right from the outset, it's challenging. Let's begin with this. He says, it seems the consensus of opinion of the great minds of the world, and it has been nearly demonstrated by researchers into physical nature, meaning physics, that we are the outcome and manifestation of an absolute condition, back of our present relative condition, and are going forward to return to that absolute. This being granted, I mean, this is a kind of a massive claim. And he seems to be taking it for granted. And first of all, I'm sort of wondering what he has in mind by this consensus of opinion of the great thinkers of the world and late 19th century physics. Any scientists out there who can help me with that? That we come from the absolute and that we're going to go back to the absolute. It's not entirely clear to me what he has in mind. So if any of you can think of something, let me know. So that's the first puzzle. I don't have all the answers. Okay. And so then he makes this whopping, he says, this being granted, this claim which seems to us to be very controversial, seems to me at least to be highly controversial. If we take it for granted, then the next question is, this is the key question that kind of structures his entire introduction. The key question, which is better, the absolute from which we came or the current state, our present state of existence? And then the rest of the paragraph, which you just read, he says they're not wanting people who think that this manifested state is the highest state of man. So they answer by saying that the current state is better. Who are these people? Any ideas? Who? Materialists. It's interesting. It's an interesting possibility. Materialists. The only thing is, yeah, it's Charvaka materialism. But the thing is, would they even accept the premise that we came from the absolute? Well, they might ask, what the heck is the absolute? Yeah.
Well, I don't think that science ever posits a absolute.
I know.
But there was, I know, like in the 50s and 60s, they were saying that matter is just a perchance concollocation was something a word of atoms. Just
right.
a lucky thing that atoms got together and created the universe.
Yeah,
but they
I know.
Never
Yeah,
said that there was such a thing as an absolute, or that it was even going back to the absolute.
I think part of the issue is what does Swami Vivekananda mean by absolute here? Does it really mean something that has to be transcendental? I don't think so, because otherwise it's not clear how physics.
Scientists in the East Coast at that time?
I honestly don't know. I think there are hands back there too. Yeah. So,
I think atheists would even consider this to be the most realized state, primarily because they don't consider there to be any specific
but what is the
origin.
absolute for them, for atheists?
There
Because she
isn't one
suggests,
really.
huh? I know, but remember the premise here.
Yeah.
There's a consensus of opinion that we come from the absolute, are now in the relative state, and we're going to eventually go back to the absolute. Taking that for granted, which is better? So now, if you say atheists, I mean, it might be. I think it's confused. I mean, I'm a little confused by
I don't
this.
think you can take that for granted. That seems like a off-the-wall statement.
Well, so that's part of the issue. Fortunately, later in the same introduction, he does give some arguments in favor of the claim. So we'll get to that, or hopefully, if you let me. Okay. Okay. So I think what he has in mind here now. First of all, remember the key question: which is better, that absolute state or the current state? And then he says there's some people who think that the current state is better. And I think that he has in mind Hegel. He studied Hegel when he was an undergraduate philosophy major at Scottish Church College in Kolkata. He had Western teachers, and he learned Western philosophy primarily. Kant, some Hegel, Schopenhauer, stuff like that. And I studied Hegel quite a bit during my doctoral career, and this does strongly suggest Hegel's view in a kind of broad way. Hegel he believed in an absolute, capital A. In German, the term is absolut. And what Hegel said is that the absolute in itself is somehow lifeless, and he used the term undifferentiated, undifferenziert, which is the same term that Swamiji uses here, undifferentiated being. And that it's more desirable. And then what happens is the whole adventure of this world and the way the world has evolved in the course of time is the progressive manifestation of the absolute, or what he also calls absolute spirit. Okay? At all levels, at the level of society, at the level of nature, and so on and so forth. And he says that absolute becomes richer through that manifestation. And that's why it's more desirable than the originary, initial state of the absolute, which is strictly undifferentiated. Okay? Yeah.
Wouldn't that follow then that Nietzsche would be an example of the continuation of the idea of the Superman and that greatest level of materialistic living would be an example of the height of development?
I don't think Swami Vivekananda read Nietzsche, so I don't think he necessarily has him in mind. There are other figures but one thing about Hegel, unlike Nietzsche, is that Nietzsche was an atheist, whereas Hegel was a theist and believed in a transcendental absolute. That's why I think that is what he has in mind here is Hegel, primarily, and followers of Hegel, that's my guess. Okay, let's continue, because there are a few more pages that we need to get through. Then he says, and this is where the structure becomes it's important to kind of have this higher altitude map of what's going on. Because he just asks this big question, which is higher, our current state or going back to the absolute? He first talks about Hegel, who says that the current state's higher. And then you might expect him to say, now let's look at other answers to this question. He doesn't do that. Let's read first and then I'll explain. First of all, we want to inquire into other solutions of life. What are these other solutions of life, and how do they relate to the main question? Let's read on. He says, there was an old solution that man after death remained the same, that all his good sides minus his evil sides remained forever. Logically stated, that means that man's goal is the world. This world carried a stage higher and eliminated of its evils is the state they call heaven. This theory, on the face of it, is absurd and puerile because it cannot be. There cannot be good without evil, nor evil without good. To live in a world where it is all good and no evil is what Sanskrit logicians call a dream in the air. Let's pause again. Here again. First of all, how does what he just said relate to what he said previously in this key question? I think what he's doing is, again, this is my reconstruction, you can disagree with me. He's now going to explain two different, what he calls other solutions of life, which reject that initial premise. The initial premise was, we came from the absolute, we're now in the relative state, we're going to go back to the absolute. I think, this is my own understanding, that he's now going to discuss two solutions to the problem of life which reject that premise. One of them, and this first one is a very old solution. What's the solution? The belief in a certain kind of heaven, in which me, every Tom, Dick, and Harry, or Susan, or the goal is to reach a heaven in which we are exactly the same person, except subtract all our bad qualities. And it's exactly the same world, but subtract all the bad things from the world. And that's heaven. And Swami Vivekananda makes fun of this idea and kind of ridicules it and says it's absurd because you cannot have good without evil because they're dvandas, they're dualities. One cannot exist without the other. So now one question that arises in this context is he rejecting an eternal heaven of the sort that is championed in theistic religions like Christianity and Islam, even theistic traditions within Hinduism, the belief in an eternal loka, L-O-K-A, a transcendental realm which is eternal, in which you can dwell with Krishna or Kali or Ramakrishna. There's also Ramakrishna Loka, as Holy Mother talked about. What do you think? Is he rejecting all eternal heavens? Or is he doing something else or more subtle than that?
Yes.
Huh?
Seems that way so far.
Can you give the mic? It seems like he's rejecting the idea of all forms of eternal heaven.
Yeah, I said it seems that way so far.
Yeah. Well, he's not going to pursue this any further. So.
Oh, okay, so then yes.
I'm telling you, this text is hard. So this is all we got. I think it would be over hasty to think that he's rejecting all forms of eternal heaven. But it's controversial, and you're entitled to your own view. There are a few reasons for this. One is because look at the way he's describing this kind of heaven. He's saying that the person who reaches this goal remains the same person. Kiran is still Kiran, I'm still me. The same empirical person in this final state. And the world is exactly the same world except minus the evil. It's a very idiosyncratic conception of heaven, it seems to me. And I don't think this is an apt characterization of the Christian heaven even, necessarily, or the Islamic heaven, Jannah, or the heaven for Vaishnavas. Why? Because, first of all, that loka is it's not the bhuloka, it's not this earthly realm with physical things, it's a spiritual realm. And the people in it, they're not even people, they're souls, they're eternal souls, completely independent of the body-mind complex. And the empirical personality that we have now is not present at all in that final state of heaven that these theistic traditions talk about. Sorry, I should speak closer to the mic. So that's my sense that, and there's another reason. This is, because again, I said this yesterday in my gospel class, but it's worth reiterating, that to understand a person's views, it's very useful to see what they say elsewhere in their corpus. And so Swamiji, in his book Bhakti Yoga, in a section called The Philosophy of Ishvara, Ishvara meaning the personal God, he says, he's talking about these two different goals. The goal of the jnani is like the salt doll melting into the ocean, non-dual pure consciousness. becoming sugar. And the goal of bhaktas is eating sugar in an eternal heaven. So it's in that context. He says, those who attain to that state where there is neither creation, nor created, nor creator, where there is neither knower, nor knowable, nor knowledge, where there is neither I, nor thou, nor he, where there is neither subject, nor object, nor relation, there who is seen by whom? Such persons have gone beyond everything to where words cannot go, nor mind, gone to that which the Shrutis declare as not this, not this. That's all the description of becoming sugar, right? Then, but for those who cannot or will not, if it was just cannot, we can even say he's just a classical Advaitin, or will not. The key phrase is or will not reach the state. There will inevitably remain the triune vision of the one undifferentiated Brahman as nature, soul, and the interpenetrating sustainer of both, Ishvara. So I think here what he's suggesting is, even after liberation, depending on your proclivity as a liberated soul, you can choose either to become sugar or to eat sugar. And he even adds in another place, he says, who cares to become sugar, says the bhakta, I want to taste sugar. Who will then desire to become free and one with God? And then he's quoting this bhakta, I may know that I am he, yet will I take myself away from him and become different so that I may enjoy the beloved, end quote. And then Swamiji says, that is what the bhakta says. Love for love's sake is his highest enjoyment. So I think if you take all these passages together, I think we get a more complete picture of what he's saying. And that I think he's critiquing a very idiosyncratic and specific conception of heaven, but not the eternal heaven taught in Christianity, Islam, or theistic Hindu traditions. Okay. Let's continue. So this is now, so he just finished and he's done with talking about the first solution of life that rejects this premise that we came from the absolute and are going to eventually go back to the absolute. Now the second one, the second solution of life, which also rejects this premise, is the following. Another theory in modern times, the previous theory was an old theory, now this is a modern theory. Another theory in modern times has been presented by several schools. No idea what these schools are. I looked it up a little bit and I couldn't, no success, no dice. Another theory in modern times has been presented by several schools that man's destiny is to go on always improving, always struggling towards but never reaching the goal. This statement, though apparently very nice, is also absurd because there is no such thing as motion in a straight line. Every motion is in a circle. If you can take up a stone and project it into space and then live long enough, that stone, if it meets with no obstruction, will come back exactly to your hand. A straight line, infinitely projected, must end in a circle. Therefore, this idea that the destiny of man is progressing ever forward and never stopping is absurd. Although extraneous to the subject, I may remark that this idea explains the ethical theory that you must not hate and must love. Because, just as in the case of electricity, the modern theory is that the power leaves the dynamo and completes the circle back to the dynamo, so with hate and love. They must come back to the source. Therefore, do not hate anybody, because that hatred which comes out from you must, in the long run, come back to you. If you love, that love will come back to you, completing the circle. It is as certain as can be that every bit of hatred that goes out of the heart of a man comes back to him in full force. Nothing can stop it. Similarly, every impulse of love comes back to him. I'm going to read the next paragraph because it's also concerning this modern theory. On other and practical grounds, we see that the theory of eternal progression, that same theory, is untenable, for destruction is the goal of everything earthly. All our struggles and hopes and fears and joys, what will they lead to? We shall all end in death. Nothing is so certain as this. Where then is this motion in a straight line, this infinite progression? It is only going out to a distance and coming back to the center from which it started. See how from nebulae the sun, moon, and stars are produced. Then they dissolve and go back to nebulae. The same is being done everywhere. The plant takes material from the earth, dissolves, and gives it back. Every form in this world is taken out of surrounding atoms and goes back to these atoms. It cannot be that the same law acts differently in different places. Law is uniform. Nothing is more certain than that. If this is the law of nature, it also applies to thought. Thought will dissolve and go back to its origin. Whether we will it or not, we shall have to return to our origin, which is called God or Absolute. We all came from God, and we are all bound to go back to God. He's using the term God now for the first time. Call that by any name you like. God, absolute, or nature. The fact remains the same, quote, from whom all this universe comes out, in whom all that is born lives, and to whom all returns, end quote. This is one fact that is certain. Nature works on the same plan. What is being worked out in one sphere is repeated in millions of spheres. What you see with the planets, the same will it be with this earth, with men, and with all. The huge wave is a mighty compound of small waves, it may be of millions. The life of the whole world is a compound of millions of little lives, and the death of the whole world is a compound of the deaths of these millions of little beings. Again, very challenging. I think a lot of what he's saying here is very difficult. One thing that I think is easy to understand is this modern theory, even though it's not entirely clear which figures he had in mind, which thinkers from, I guess, the late 19th century or whatever. This is the view that there is no goal that we can reach. There's only infinite progress. We can make progress, but we can never reach any endpoint. That seems to be the view. And he's arguing that that's implausible for a number of reasons. He thinks it's absurd. And he gives a really interesting, sort of like almost mathematical or physical claim that it's not possible for a straight line to go infinitely straight, that eventually it's going to curve back on itself, like a boomerang. And you can ask yourself whether that is plausible to you or not. And he draws out an ethical lesson from that, which is that if we give love, then we're eventually going to get back love. If we exude hatred, we're eventually going to receive hatred from others. That seems plausible to me. And then he sort of says the same thing in a different way, but more using physical examples in the paragraph that I just read to you. Because he's talking about nebulae, the sun. Okay, so it's from nebulae that the sun, moon, and stars are produced, and then they dissolve and go back to nebulae. And so again and again, there's this sort of return to the original state. That seems to be the suggestion. There's no such thing as linear progress infinitely. Eventually, you're going to come back to your original state. So what is he doing? He's arguing against these views which reject the premise that we come back from an original state, call it the absolute, and that eventually we're going to go back to that state. Okay? So you see how he's already these are kind of arguments. How good they are is up to you guys. We can talk about that another time maybe. But he does present some arguments. And the other thing is he sort of vaguely clarifies what he means by absolute. He says, call that by any name you like, God, absolute, or nature. The fact remains that I think this might give us a clue as to why he was thinking of maybe how physics might be supporting this view, because if we take it as nature, we might even get this materialism and / what was the other? Yeah. So so even if you don't believe in anything transcendental, any God, if you take the absolute to be something strictly material like nature, then maybe 19th century physicists were arguing something along those lines and that might seem plausible. There's a big bang, right, from which everything comes, and then eventually the big crunch where everything will go back. Yeah, but maybe there was some proto-theory of that. I don't know what it was. I mean, I don't know anything about physics, and especially 19th century physics. Yeah.
And I'm not so sure that there's not a certain level of linearity to the direction of movement. Eventually it curves in back on itself. I believe there's a combination of the two. What about the shape of the helix? Mm-hmm. It's spiraling out, certainly in a circular motion, but it's still a movement.
He's still moving forward, yeah.
Yeah, that's a sense of...
Yeah, but I think the key here is he's criticizing infinite progress. He's not arguing against progress as such in linearity, but he's saying it doesn't make sense to claim that linear progress is infinite, that it goes on forever. Eventually, at some point, it's going to turn back on itself. Yeah. Okay, I think we should go on. Now, so remember the overall structure here again. He has now just argued against two theories which reject the initial premise. So now he thinks we should accept the premise, which is that we come from the absolute. We're in a degenerate state now, a relative state. We're going to eventually go back to the absolute, okay? And now, let me read. He says, now the question arises, is going back to God the higher state or not? He's reiterating that initial question, which he took a detour, now he's back. Okay. The philosophers of the yoga school emphatically answer that it is. Hegel said no, current state is better. Now he's bringing in finally the yoga school. And he's not actually going to go into the yoga school in detail at all. But he's saying the yoga school. And then he says, they say, meaning these philosophers of the yoga school, that man's present state is a degeneration. There is no one religion on the face of the earth which says that man is an improvement. So notice what he's doing here already. So now we think finally he's going to talk about Yoga Sutras. No, he's talking about all religions across the world. Yoga is just one of many. And all of them agree on this. They all believe that we come from the absolute and that eventually we must go back to the absolute. Okay? Then he says, so that's why I'm calling this introduction very high altitude. This is not a specific discussion or introduction to Yoga Sutra. Okay. The idea is that his beginning is perfect and pure. All religions believe this. That he degenerates until he cannot degenerate further. And that there must come a time when he shoots upward again to complete the circle. The circle must be described. However low he may go, he must ultimately take the upward bend and go back to the original source, which is God. Man comes from God in the beginning. In the middle, he becomes man. And in the end, he goes back to God. This is the method of putting it in the dualistic form. The monistic form is that man is God and goes back to him again. A few things here. So, is going back to God the higher state or not? He says yoga answers that it is. Already people who are scholars of yoga might say, of yoga philosophy, yoga sutra, will say, well, God doesn't play a very prominent role, and it's not even the goal of yoga philosophy to return to God. There's a concept of God, Ishvara, but in a very specific context. In this context of spiritual practice, one effective practice taught by Patanjali is worship of and surrender to Ishvara, God, the personal God. But the goal is not going back to God. The goal is to realize your true nature as a Purusha, as an eternal soul, pure consciousness, separate from the body-mind complex. Because we suffer now because we mistakenly identify with the body-mind complex. So I think what Swamiji has in mind here is, I think he's using God in a very general sense. That's my feeling. To include even the Purusha. That's how I see it, yeah.
So, but, when he says that man is a degenerate state, but he also accepts evolution, and that at first there was protoplasm, and it kept evolving and evolving and evolving, and it's getting better toward the point of human intelligence being a manifestation of God, and
right.
that it's going to keep growing.
Right.
But but eventually that goes back to
the absolute
seed form and all that. So.
Yeah. So the thing is,
this kind of thing is degenerate.
Yeah.
Okay, it's only one point of his view. He
right.
has other views too.
Yeah, but the thing is, I mean, this again, we're going to find in the next page, that in the next paragraph, that there are two phases. Okay, we start with the absolute. Then there's this phase of degeneration. Then he says the next phase is the phase of what he calls regeneration. And then we come back to the absolute. So evolution is part of this, right? It's degeneration followed by regeneration followed by returning to the absolute. That's the idea. Okay. The other thing I wanted to bring your attention to is, he says, however low he may go, he must ultimately take the upward bend and go back to the original source, which is God. This strongly suggests to me the doctrine of universal salvation or universal liberation, which is something that Swamiji definitely believed. But the question is it plausible to attribute that view to all religions across the world? I don't think so. The reason being that Orthodox Christianity typically accepts an eternal hell. So does Islam, Orthodox Islam. Even certain Hindu traditions, fortunately only a few very rare ones, but Madhva's school of Dvaita Vedanta, Madhva Vedanta, they also seem to accept that they don't believe in universal liberation. They believe that some souls are destined for an eternal hell. Other souls are doomed to transmigrate endlessly without any escape. And so, I mean, this would just, if Swamiji were here, I would ask him, how do you explain these religions which do not accept universal liberation? Anyway. And then he contrasts these two different ways of, so he's talking about all religions, then he distinguishes dualistic religions from monistic religions, which is interesting. And the formulation is interesting. The dualistic formulation is, the monistic, here it goes. Dualistic. Man comes from God in the beginning. So notice there's already a distinction between God on the one hand and man on the other. Man comes from God. In the middle, he becomes man. And in the end, he goes back to God. But there's always some kind of distinction between man and God here. I think that's the dualism. What's the monistic form? Man is God and goes back to him again. But if man is God, why would you need to go back? So he skips that. But I think the idea is, and this is true of Kashmiri Shaivism, Advaita Vedanta, that the root problem is ignorance of what we actually are. We are God, but we don't know it. And so going back to God actually means, in monistic traditions, realizing that we already are God, removing our ignorance about the fact that we're already God. Okay? Let's continue. And here again, remember I said that he does present arguments for why the present state is a degeneration from this higher state of the absolute. He's now giving another argument. I think this is the most interesting argument, so let's read it. He says, if our present state is the higher one, so he's arguing now against Hegel, and then why is there so much horror and misery? And why is there an end to it? An end to this world. If this is the higher state, why does it end? That which corrupts and degenerates cannot be the highest state. Why should it be so diabolical, so unsatisfying? It is only excusable inasmuch as through it we are taking a higher groove. We have to pass through it in order to become regenerate again. Remember, that's the second phase of regeneration. Put a seed into the ground and it disintegrates, dissolves after a time, and out of that dissolution comes the splendid tree. Every soul must disintegrate to become God. I really like that statement. So it follows that the sooner we get out of the state we call man, the better for us. Is it by committing suicide that we get out of the state? Not at all. That will be making it worse. Torturing ourselves or condemning the world is not the way to get out. We have to pass through the slough of despond, and the sooner we are through, the better. It must always be remembered that man's state is not the highest state. So here's the argument he gives. He's saying that the present state can't be the highest state because it's terrible. Well, there's a lot of bad stuff here. And so it's not reasonable to think that this is the highest state. It's diabolical. Every time we think that, if I only get X, Y, or Z, then I'll be happy. What happens when you get X, Y, or Z? Still not happy. That's why it's so unsatisfying, right? And when he says every soul must disintegrate to become God, what does he mean? I think he means it's really about the disintegration of ego or selfishness. That's the way I see it. In order to regenerate, Sri Ramakrishna would say, as the Bhaktarami, the eye of a devotee, or if you're a monist, as Brahman. Okay. So now, and the other thing is he raises this problem of evil. And he asks, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? And he says, the spiritual answer is, because evil and suffering are the goads that help us to evolve and progress and grow morally and spiritually. Just look back on your own lives, and I think you'll see that that's true. It's through suffering, through anguish, through seeing evil qualities in the world and in ourselves that we grow, because we see the consequences of that evil, and we say, whoa, maybe we shouldn't do that again, or learn from what other people are doing that are really bad. You see what I mean? And if the world were just that's why in Hinduism, in these swargas, these temporary heavens, they say that you can't make moral progress. You don't accrue any new karma. You can't evolve because everything is so hunky-dory. You need to be challenged. You need pushback. You have to see the dark side of things to grow. All right. Let's continue. Another very interesting paragraph. He says, the really difficult part to understand is that this state, the absolute, which has been called the highest, is not, as some fear, that of the zoophyte or of the stone. According to them, so who are these people? These people that he's talking about who think that the absolute is like an insentient, lifeless state. According to them, there are only two states of existence, one of the stone and the other of thought. What right have they to limit existence to these two? Is there not something infinitely superior to thought? The vibrations of light, when they are very low, we do not see. When they become a little more intense, they become light to us. When they become still more intense, we do not see them. It is dark to us. Is the darkness in the end the same darkness as in the beginning? Certainly not. They are different as the two poles. Is the thoughtlessness of the stone the same as the thoughtlessness of God? I love this question too. It's beautiful. Certainly not. God does not think. He does not reason. Why should he? Is anything unknown to him that he should reason? The stone cannot reason. God does not. Notice, the stone cannot reason. God does not reason. Such is the difference. These philosophers think it is awful if we go beyond thought. They find nothing beyond thought. This is another reason why I think he had Hegel in mind in the beginning, because Hegel is one of these people who elevates Vernunft, which is a German word for reason with a capital R, as the highest state. And he doesn't seem to, and he also rejects the possibility of direct spiritual experience like Kant. So I think that's one of these philosophers that Swamiji has in mind, Hegel, the German philosopher. And the other thing is this beautiful idea he has. This, I think, anticipates a nice doctrine of Ken Wilber's. Ken Wilber, some of you have at least heard of him, right? He's a transpersonal psychologist. He's still living, but he's quite old now, I think. He came up with this idea which he called the pre-trans fallacy. Pre/trans fallacy. I talked about it in a class I gave a number of months ago on Sigmund Freud and Romain Rolland. But the idea is, he says, a lot of people dismiss mystical experience for being sort of a regression to an infantile state. So Freud and Freudians and people who follow a kind of psychoanalytic approach, they tend to do this. They tend to say that it's a regression. It's a kind of pre-adult and premature state of being. And Wilber says you're making the mistake of the pre-trans fallacy. You're committing the pre-trans fallacy. He says that there is a state below thought, like the state of a baby who is obviously not yet rational. And then there's a state beyond thought. So it's a difference between pre-rationality, right, being in a pre-rational state or sub-rational state, which is a state of a baby, for instance, and a post- or supra-rational state, which is a state of mystics. And the mistake that these people make, that people who follow Freud and whatever, psychoanalysis, and others also, is to conflate these two radically different states, the pre and the trans states. There's a sub-rational state and then a super-rational state. And so God is obviously supra-rational. The stone, sub-rational, right? Okay, so now let's finish the introduction and then we'll discuss what remains. There are much higher states of existence beyond reasoning. Another very bold claim. It is really beyond the intellect that the first state of religious life is to be found. When you step beyond thought and intellect and all reasoning, then you have made the first step towards God. And that is the beginning of life. What is commonly called life is but an embryo state. The next question will be, what proof is there that the state beyond thought and reasoning is the highest state? In the first place, all the great men of the world, much greater than those that only talk, men who moved the world, men who never thought of any selfish ends whatever, have declared that this life is but a little stage on the way towards infinity, which is beyond. In the second place, they not only say so, but show the way to everyone, explain their methods, that all can follow in their steps. In the third place, there is no other way left. Now it gets really subtle, so please concentrate. In the third place, there is no other way left. There is no other explanation. Taking for granted that there is no higher state, why are we going through this circle all the time? What reason can explain the world? The sensible world will be the limit to our knowledge if we cannot go farther, if we must not ask for anything more. This is what is called agnosticism. But what reason is there to believe in the testimony of the senses? I would call that man a true agnostic who would stand still in the street and die. If reason is all in all, it leaves us no place to stand on this side of nihilism. If a man is agnostic of everything but money, fame, and name, he is only a fraud. Kant has proved beyond all doubt that we cannot penetrate beyond the tremendous dead wall called reason. But that is the very first idea upon which all Indian thought takes its stand and dares to seek and succeeds in finding something higher than reason, where alone the explanation of the present state is to be found. This is the value of the study of something that will take us beyond the world. Quote, "Thou art our Father, and will take us to the other shore of this ocean of ignorance," end quote. That is the science of religion, nothing else. End of introduction. Very little discussion of Yoga Sutra, but very powerful and interesting and challenging, as I said. So this one paragraph, again, is really packed with all sorts of stuff here. So after raising this question, which state is higher, the present state or the state of the absolute from which we came? He's arguing, obviously, the absolute, right? Now, the next question is, how do we even know that it's possible to attain this highest state of the absolute? Spiritual experience. Why should we believe that it's possible? Many people are skeptical these days, especially. If you talk about mystics, they'll say, why should we believe that they really had that? It could just be a subjective hallucination. I think that's what he's tackling here. And it's very subtle. He's giving 3 arguments for the view that he's defending, which is that there is a spiritual state beyond reasoning, a supra-rational state that people can attain. First argument, saints and sages throughout the world claim that they have directly attained the state. And we have good reason to believe them because they're credible, because if they really attain that kind of state, they should be fundamentally different human beings from the rest of us. They should be devoid of selfishness and egoism and pettiness, and lo and behold, they are. The Jesuses and Ramakrishnas and Buddhas of the world all seem to be. You see what I mean? So that's the first argument. But then you might still say, why should we accept their testimony? They could be good people. You don't even have to necessarily deny that. But maybe they're just good, and that they don't necessarily. We don't need to take their claims at face value that they've realized God or some kind of absolute state. So he goes on. He says, "Oh, actually, let me say a little bit more here. I mean, there's a lot packed here regarding why should we believe the testimony of saints and sages." In his 1895 lecture, Steps to Realization, he says the following. What is the proof of God? Direct perception, pratyaksha. The Sanskrit term for perception is pratyaksha. Then he says, the proof of this wall is that I perceive it. God has been perceived that way by thousands before and will be perceived by all who want to perceive him. But this perception is no sense perception at all. It is supersensuous, superconscious. So I think what he's doing here is very subtle. It's a subtle philosophical argument. What he's saying is, how do I know that I'm speaking to a bunch of people in this room and that there are pews here, that there's a rug here, that there's a mic here? The only answer is because I perceive them, right? I accept the testimony of my senses, right? And we routinely accept the perceptual testimony of other people too. That's what a weather forecast is, or not even forecast, but like, if I'm about to leave my house and my dad says, hey, it's raining out, you should take an umbrella. I'll accept what he says. That's sense testimony, sense perceptual testimony. And we take it for granted. We read newspapers all the time, also based on sense perceptual testimony, right? So what he's saying is, exactly in the same way, he says, how do we know that God exists? Well, because there are many people who claim to have directly experienced God, exactly in the way that we're experiencing this wall. And if we accept the one kind of testimony, sense perceptual testimony, there's absolutely no good reason not to accept mystical testimony. That's the argument in a nutshell, and it gets much more complicated. If you want the details, you have to read about 80 pages of my book, this book. It's chapters 5 and 6 of Swami Vivekananda's Vedanta Cosmopolitanism. Yeah, no.
But he also says you don't have to just believe it. He says they lay out a way of experiencing it yourself.
That's number 2. I was about to get there. Thank you. But thank you for anticipating me. Yes. Good. So that's the first argument. And second, he says, these saints have laid out exactly how we ourselves, each one of us, can attain the same super-rational spiritual state of being, of existence. And so Swamiji says, and this goes back to his preface and introduction, if you remember from 2 or 3 months ago, when he's talking about verification. Why is religion a science? Because it's equally based on verification, just as physics or chemistry is. Chemists tell you if you mix this chemical with that chemical, you'll end up with this result. We can do it ourselves exactly like that. Not exactly like that, but it's a little bit tougher, that's all. The mixing the chemicals is a tough part in spiritual life.
You also get pointers on the way to show you you're going in the right direction.
Yeah, it's not impossible, and everybody will eventually reach the goal, but it is not the easiest thing in the world. Becoming perfectly unselfish and eradicating ego, these are not simple things. Not as easy as mixing, carbolic acid with something else. So, anyway, but the basic structure is the same. The structure of verification, that's the idea. Okay, and verification. And finally, the third part is what I said is the most difficult to follow what he's saying, and it's really kind of tricky. Remember, what is the argument here? He's making an argument that reason is not the highest state, okay? And he's presenting a few arguments. Saints and sages throughout the world say that it's not the highest state. There's a higher spiritual state beyond reason, number 1. Number 2, they tell us the steps to take in order to reach that same highest super-rational state. And third, if we take reason to be the highest, we land in an untenable, it's a kind of reductio. In philosophy, we call you end up in a reductio ad absurdum, which means you end up with an absurdity. And not exactly an absurdity, but it's impossible to live. We cannot live life thinking that reason is the highest. Maybe that's the best way to put it. Sorry for confusing you. Okay. And here's what he says. Here's how he argues this position. What reason is there to believe in the testimony of the senses? See, he's coming with this very interesting idea. If we just rely on reasoning, we have absolutely no reason to believe that any of this is real. And this is not unique to him. Descartes said that hundreds of years before Swamiji. Who's the great Chinese philosopher? The one who said that, am I a man dreaming that I'm a butterfly, or am I a butterfly dreaming that I'm a man? It's like Xuanxi or something. I don't know the pronunciation, but this goes back a long, long time. And in Yogacara Buddhism and in other traditions, you get the same kind of idea. Because it's entirely possible that I'm dreaming all this. How can I possibly prove that this is a real pew that I'm looking at now? If you say, well, because I see it too, but you're in my dream. Or you could be in my dream. If this is a dream, then the dream people are verifying the dream pew. And then when I wake up from the dream, I realize that even the verifiers were part of that dream. It's part of that fiction. That doesn't help me. There's no way out. So if we take reason to be the highest, we end up, he says, then we shouldn't believe even in the testimony of our senses, which means we have no rationale for even getting up out of this chair or doing anything in life. And he says, but notice, none of you behave like that. None of you are standing still in the street and dying, which is what you should be doing if you took reason to be the highest. You go on with you get out of bed when you hear the alarm, you get in the shower, you eat your breakfast, you go to work, you raise your kids. None of that is possible unless you accept some kind of higher state beyond reason. This is the idea. It's interesting. The argument is interesting. I want you to think more about it. And then, finally, he says, he brings in Kant. And we talked about him yesterday, too, because we were talking about Vidyasagar, the great Pandit that Sri Ramakrishna met. And Vidyasagar was expressing views that seemed kind of Kantian. So Swamiji, of all the German philosophers, he seemed to have known Kant better than some of the others. He didn't know German, but he read some of the texts, I think, parts of these texts in English translation. He says, Kant has proved beyond all doubt that we cannot penetrate beyond the tremendous dead wall called reason. What is he thinking of here? I think he's thinking of Kant's claim that we, with our finite rational minds, can never know we can never gain direct knowledge of supersensible entities like God or the soul. This is one of Kant's fundamental claims, and he gives a bunch of arguments for this. Swamiji is saying Kant in a way is right. But see, notice he's actually agreeing in a sense, because he's saying Kant has proved beyond all doubt. If it's beyond all doubt, then we can't doubt it, which means Swamiji seems to agree. What is he agreeing with? We cannot penetrate beyond the tremendous dead wall called reason. Here I think we have to be a little careful. I think what he agrees with, what I think Swamiji agrees with, is that we cannot know God with our rational minds. Yato vacho nivattante apraapya manasa saha, like Taittiriya Upanishad says that this Brahman is beyond reasoning and it's beyond words. So it's strictly Vedanta. Any Vedantin will agree with Kant on that point. Where he disagrees with Kant, this is why the next sentence, but that is the very first idea upon which all Indian thought takes its stand and dares to seek and succeeds in finding something higher than reason, where alone the explanation of the present state is to be found. Here's where Swamiji differs from Kant. Kant says, tough luck for us, because we're stuck with these rational minds and we can never go beyond them. It's not possible to have direct, supersensuous knowledge of God or the soul. Swamiji says, Vedanta says, yes, we can. You're right, Kant, that through the rational mind we can never know God or the soul. But if we can transcend reason, we can have direct spiritual knowledge of God and the soul. This is where he says Vedanta and yoga parts ways with Kant. And why should we believe that? For the reasons he gave earlier, the testimony of saints and sages, the fact that they even prescribe steps as to how each of us can attain that same state, and because believing that reason is the highest lands us in absurdities, and we wouldn't be able to get on in the world in the way that we do. Okay, so that's a lot. It's very heavy. So, any questions? How in the world does any of this relate to the Yoga Sutra? Is that one of the... as I said, a very high altitude way. He's defending the possibility of spiritual experience. I mean, these things that many people in his time and even now doubt. And I think it's even helpful for us as spiritual aspirants, because sometimes these same kind of doubts arise in our own minds. So it's good to think about these things. Okay, so any questions? Anything online?
There's a couple online, yeah.
Okay. Should I try to read them? I can attempt it.
Better.
Okay, let me try. I usually fail. How do I do this? How do I go there? Medhananda, Raja Yoga. Got it. Okay. How do I go there? Wow. It's creepy. Okay. That's circling back on yourself. Okay, let's see here. Okay, Patty asks, was Swamiji also aware of the transcendental movement in the U.S., people like Emerson who believed in an oversoul, absolute, plus the true individual? That's a really interesting question. I think he probably was, and I find it surprising that he never explicitly mentions Emerson or Thoreau. He visited Boston. I think he praised Whitman, Walt Whitman. It was also kind of that same sort of milieu of American 19th century transcendentalism. And he liked Whitman's poetry. I don't think he makes any direct references to Emerson, but it's possible that he was aware of Emerson. Next question. Stanley Robluski, who seems to know something about physics, says JWST, what is that? Is that like some high-powered telescope or something? JWST's images of black holes, huh?
James Webb Space Telescope.
That's it, James Webb Space Telescopes. Images of black holes and other data show that the universes are doing exactly that. Energy, Purusha, is transforming eternally back and with matter, nature, Shakti. That's interesting. So you're saying that at least contemporary physics supports the view that Swamiji says 19th century physics supported, which is that we're going to go back to the absolute, but in the form of matter, right? But Swamiji allows that because he says, call that by any name you like, God, absolute, or nature. So from the standpoint of natural physics, you can think of the absolute as nature. So thank you, Stanley, for suggesting that. And then spiritual scientist asks, even though Swami Vivekananda accepted eternal heaven for bhaktas, isn't that true that he was primarily inclined towards Advaita only? He said that Neti followers have gone beyond everything. It's a good question, and the answer can be found in this wonderful book written by a genius named Swami Medhananda. I'm joking. Swami Vivekananda's Vedanta Cosmopolitan. And I discuss it at length in chapters 1 and 2, 1 through 3 really, of the book. And the key question here is, what kind of Advaitin was Swamiji? Nobody can deny that he was an Advaitin, but the question is, what kind of Advaitin? I'm going to Texas in a few weeks, and the title of the talk I'm giving in Austin, wait for it, Shankara and Sri Ramakrishna, a tale of two Advaitas. I like it. Okay, I hope you like it too. So that's the idea, is that there's Advaita and there's Advaita. Advaita just means that there's one reality, right? But there are different ways of explaining that Advaitic philosophy. One way is to say, non-dual pure consciousness alone is real, everything else, illusion, unreal. That's Shankara's Advaita. Sri Ramakrishna's Advaita, Swami Vivekananda's Advaita is, there's only one reality, it's the divine. But is the world unreal? No, the world is also divine. Are we unreal? No, you're also divine. Each individual soul is a real manifestation of the divine. The personal God, it's the dynamic aspect, the personal aspect of the same divine. You see how that's equally Advaitic, because there's nothing but the divine, but it denies nothing. It accepts everything as an aspect or manifestation of that same divine. So I see Swamiji as defending this, what I call integral Advaita philosophy. And I do that in detail, as I said, in chapters 1 through 3 of this book. And yeah, you see, if you just look at some of the titles of his lectures, one is called God in Everything. And he gives a very different interpretation of Ishopanishad than Shankara's, where Shankara tends to deny the existence of the world when he's writing his commentaries on the scriptures. Swamiji doesn't do that. And there are many other things that we can see, that I try to amass that evidence in these chapters. Stanley, I think he's responding to spiritual scientist question. Swami Abhedananda was inclined towards Advaita only. The Guru Bhais used to call him Kali Vedanti. Yeah, so all is true. But as I said, the thing that I'm pushing you guys on is, what does Advaita mean? You know, I'm not denying that Swamiji was an Advaitin. I'm not denying that Sri Ramakrishna was an Advaitin. But what kind of Advaita did they actually espouse? And I think if you look carefully at their teachings, you'll find that it's a more integral Advaita. It's an all-encompassing Advaita that accepts the reality of this world as a real manifestation of the one divine truth. Okay, I think that wraps up the online questions. So any in-person questions before we wrap up the class? Or any questions about the homework assignment? I don't want to hear any excuses on the 21st of March when you say, Maharaj, I didn't do the homework because of X, Y, and Z. No? Okay, so everyone's going to come in prepared. Huh? You don't have to. There is a soft copy available. So if you want a hard copy, then you can either get it from a library, I guess, or yeah, you'd have to buy the book. Okay? So, or soft copy. And the Kindle is like 99 cents or something. It's like really cheap. Yeah, and you use a Kindle, so why don't you just use Kindle? There you go. Yeah. Any other questions? So I expect you to do your homework. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.